Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser, and for today's episode, I have on with me a very special guest. Let's welcome in one of the founding members and the voice of one of South Florida's finest punk bands, Broken Talent. We have on Malcolm Tent. Malcolm, how are you? Welcome into the podcast.
Good to be here, Mang. It is an absolute pleasure, honor, thrill, chill, and quite possibly a spill. Great to be here.
I like it.
Jeff Kaiser.
It's great to have you. I've been looking forward to this episode. I'm a big fan of Broken Talent. I know you have done a lot more than just Broken Talent in your musical journey. So we're going to get into a lot of things in your life, going back to the very beginning, all the way to what you have going on in the present. So let's take that trip down memory lane and start off in the very beginning. Talk about where you grew up.
Well, where I grew up was unincorporated Northwest Dade. Technically Hialeah, but it wasn't really a city. It was a development called Palm Springs North, and it was in the upper Northwest 170s. It was 85th Avenue and 179th Street. So we were, at that time, very far north and very far west. And it was just your average South Florida development, nothing but concrete block structures. The development had, I think, 5 different house plans, and they repeated each plan house by house. You had design 1, design 2, design 3, design 4, design 5, repeat, design 1, design 2, design 3, throughout the entire neighborhood. So the house I grew up in had the exact same design as my neighbor Tommy, and oddly enough, the same design as Big Santo, the lead singer for Broken Talent. So there was always this kind of weird sense of disconnect and deja vu when you visited your friends in my neighborhood, because we all lived in only one of 5 different house designs. And it was also typical South Florida development in that it was culturally bereft, culturally adrift, and had really nothing to offer anybody who was of an avant-garde or weird persuasion. Very typical of South Florida.
Yeah.
Having said that, I liked it. I liked the neighborhood itself. There was always trees to climb, and we had this big plot of undeveloped land behind us that we called the Everglades. So it was fun to go and run out there and ride our dirt bikes and mini bikes and just kind of explore through the tall grass. And, that aspect of it wasn't bad at all. And I've often maintained that I would have loved South Florida if it wasn't for the people.
I've heard that before from others too who have been on the podcast. And so as you're growing up, what kind of music were you listening to at this stage in your life?
Well, early on, I had a couple of things working for me musically. One was that my father always had a really good record collection. From when I was a little itty bitty baby, I used to peer over the giant wooden console record player AM/FM stereo thing that we had in the living room. It was like this huge wooden thing, and I was so little that I would have to put my hands over the edge and peer down over, and I could watch the record playing. And I specifically remember seeing the Beatles' White Album playing on the turntable. It was one of the sides that had the cut Apple record label, because they were on Apple Records, and one side was a green apple, one side was a sliced apple. I remember watching that sliced apple spin around and around and around as the Beatles' White Album played. Excuse me, but he had Beatles, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and a lot of great soul music. He had like Wilson Pickett and James Brown and Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding, like all that stuff. And on top of that, we had a radio in the house where WQAM was usually on. So you had classic top 40 AM radio of the time. And I remember clearly, They're Coming to Take Me Away, Ha Ha, by Napoleon the 14th. That's one of the very first songs I ever heard on the radio, and it probably damaged me for life. Either that or it just sort of triggered some genetic imperative to make me actualize myself. but they're coming to take me away, haha. And Fire by the Crazy World of Arthur Brown. Like that really lodged in my brain. Come and Get It by Badfinger. Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head by BJ Thomas. Like all these songs just really were kind of like shot at me with a slingshot and just landed right in there. And so that was a really good foundation. And then later on in life, when I got into my, early teens, we had Y100, which was the powerhouse FM top 40 station. And this is like way before the days of super rigid formatting. And Y100 played everything. Like in an hour, you would hear everything from Lynyrd Skynyrd to the Bee Gees, Kiss, Queen, Donna Summer. It was just amazing. They played this incredible mix of just whatever was good, whether it was disco or hard rock or soft rock or pop rock. Y100 just threw it all out there at you. And so that really, I think because of that, I never really respected or cared about genres because it was all just good music. It didn't really matter what it was or who it was. It was just good music. And of course, later on, I discovered, 103 She and K102, the hard rock stations. And so that was something that kind of triggered me, like hearing Black Sabbath for the first time and, other stuff like that. But what really, really, really helped was when K102 and 103 She, for one very brief shining moment in the late 70s, early 80s, went new wave. But that might be getting ahead of the narrative.
I imagine at this time in your life, you may have even gone to your first concert. Did you see something at this point, or maybe go to a few different shows early on, maybe in your early teens or that sort of thing?
First ever concert I went to, I will never forget, August 1st, 1980. It was myself, my friend in high school, Big Santo, and his mom and his older brother. We all went down to the Guzman Cultural Center in downtown Miami to see Devo. And I don't know if I could say that was a life-changing event. It kind of seems like I was just sort of put where I belonged for the first time ever, in this room with this incredibly loud music. I mean, louder than anything I could even imagine in my young life, with this force on stage. It was hardly even music or visual. It was just like this force. It was like this wall, this massive block of power coming at me. And it just happened to be by my favorite band in the universe, who, and they still are. Devo are my number one favorite band of all time, permanently, non-negotiable. Just forget it. No one even comes close. So that was my first full-fledged concert, and it was quite a good way to begin that sort of experience in my life.
At that time, were you aware of local music too, or was it just some of the more touring type bands?
As far as a live situation goes, I was not yet really aware of that. Like, I knew of the phenomenon of local bands, and that was mostly because of the great zines of the time, which, in spite of South Florida being the cultural desert that it was, there were oases, like a lot of good record stores. And, even before I discovered Open Books and Records and some of the other great independent record shops, even the more mainstream ones like Specs, Vibrations, Music Makers, they all had like a little tiny import section. And that's where you would find punk rock and new wave. And Peaches especially had occasional sightings of local bands. And Music Makers, way down in South Miami somewhere. It was a long drive to get down there. And I tried my parents' patience quite a bit, cadging rides to this record store or that record store, especially Music Makers, which is so far away. But Music Makers had a free magazine giveaway where they had stuff like The Rag, which was devoted to like more mainstream local music. but they also had this thing called Mouth of the Rat, which was an honest to God, bona fide punk rock zine from South Florida. That blew my mind in little tiny smithereens. And I learned a lot. I only ever found a couple of issues of Mouth of the Rat, but man, what an eye opener. And even the Rag, it was all local, so you would see references to like the Eat and Charlie Pickett and the Eggs and the Screaming Sneakers and stuff like that. So I was aware that there was such a thing as local music. But as far as being a live thing, that didn't happen until a little bit later because I was really young. I was like 14, 15 years old. And I didn't get my first fake ID until 1982, and it was far, far less than convincing. And I got laughed at when I tried to present it at the door. But we might be getting...
Why'd they laugh at you?
Well, because we had a friend who worked at the print shop in high school, and he ran off these just ridiculous ID cards. And, you got to remember, in the day before cell phones and home laser printers, you were really at the mercy of the materials you had at hand. It wasn't easy to take a photo and get it developed. This is a process that took a couple of weeks, usually. Maybe you get some photos in a couple of days if you were extremely lucky, but you still had to find a camera. You had to find someone to take your picture. You had to go get it developed. There's a lot of driving, a lot of time involved, and it was expensive, and you never knew what you were going to get. So here I am, like this 15-year-old kid. I want a fake ID. So we got the lousy-looking cards printed at the high school print shop, and I needed a photo of some sort. So the only photo I had was from an old high school ID of mine from the 9th grade. So I very carefully cut it out with a pair of scissors, it was plastic. Placed the photo on the card. They used to have these 25-cent machines where you could get laminating plastic at the grocery stores and the drugstores. So at the next trip to the local drugstore, I put my quarter in the slot and got those 2 little sheets of laminating plastic. Laminated this thing. It had bubbles and creases and bumps all over it. My plastic picture from my high school ID, which is already hopelessly out of date, was sticking up, from this thing. And that was my fake ID. So imagine the bouncer's great amusement when I showed up at Founders Lounge May 11, 1982 for the Black Flag Saccharine Trust Abusers Roach Motel show and presented this thing. And the guy, he just laughed. He just laughed at me and said, "Go away, kid."
So did you get in, or?
I did, because people behind me in line were like, "Hey, no one said it had to be a real ID. Just let him in. Let him in." They were rooting for me. And he was just like, whatever, $6. He took my $6 and I was in.
Right. Was that the first punk show you ever were in attendance for?
That was my debut to live punk rock.
Wow.
And what a debut it was.
That is a serious debut. You obviously had touring bands, right? Like Black Flag and Saccharine Trust. You mentioned Roach Motel, the great Roach Motel from Gainesville, but also had roots in South Florida. So what did you think of Roach Motel at that time?
I loved them. You got to admit, you got to remember, I was in a condition of absolute shell shock at this point. I'm a young kid. Okay, this is 1982. I was only 17 years old. And I'd never set foot in a bar before, let alone a horrendous dump like Finders. This place was a dump. You just can't imagine going from the suburbs of unincorporated Northwest Dade to a place like Finders Lounge. I thought I was in hell, just the thick fog of cigarette smoke, and the ceiling with all the tiles knocked out because it was too low to stand upright on stage, over the stage, with the lights stuck into the space where the tiles were. Everything was just completely held together by duct tape and string and jury rig. And the people, these were like real life punk rockers. I was seeing people with colored hair, people with spiky hair. The lead singer of the Abusers had a mohawk. This was unbelievable. This was like stuff you didn't even see in magazines at that time, really, let alone the atmosphere. There's this atmosphere of menace. There's this definite vibe between the local barflies and all these weird looking punk rockers. I overheard these two barflies talking about going out to the parking lot and stabbing some guy. I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing here, And I remember the lead singer of the Abusers, who at the time was this guy Glenn, who later ended up in Don't Ask Me, just on his knees, screaming into this microphone with his face turning red and the veins bulging out and his eyes shut and sweat dripping down. And he was right in front of me, This was a way different experience from going to the Sunrise Music Theater and sitting in a nice plush seat in air-conditioned comfort while the Pretenders way down there played a nice, polite set of rock music. This was a whole different thing, let alone when Roach Motel hit the stage and Bob Fetz is, screaming and yelling and he's got his shirt off and somebody coughs up a big gob and spits it right in his face and he just goes like this and keeps singing, I wanted to go home. I was just like, I can't handle this. This is, I'm not ready for this. We need to go home.
Did your parents know where you were that night?
I'm pretty sure they did. Yeah. I think they knew that I was going to a rock concert of some sort. That's about it though.
Yeah.
Like at this point I'd already been to the Guzman to see Devo, to the Sunrise to see the Pretenders, saw Devo again in 1981. So I had 3 full-blown rock concerts under my belt by this time. So why not let the kid go see another one?
Right.
What's there to lose,
With your fake ID now, were there other venues you were trying to get into?
Not really, mainly because I wasn't aware of the process. Like I really didn't know the score. I didn't know what was going on. And for that, I always have to give props to Santo. He was the only other guy in my high school who was even remotely clued in to punk rock. It was just like this pure accident that we ended up sitting by each other in first period in 9th grade. Just pure random chance. And completely bizarre and imponderable that he would actually listen while I talked about people like Devo and Elvis Costello and the Ramones and the Dickies. No one else wanted to hear about that. It was all Skinner and Van Halen and Molly Hatchet and all that. I've come to appreciate some of that music now, but at the time it was pure bullshit, because that was the music that they liked. These talentless, unimaginative, dull, stupid rednecks. They loved that bullshit. And, they, of course, didn't think that my music was worth a good goddamn, and I knew theirs wasn't. So there was that big divide, but this guy, Santo, actually was like, oh, yeah? A group called the Ramones? What's that? What kind of group has a name like the Ramones? Like, he didn't really get it, but he wanted to know. And so just by an accident of the seating chart, I found a kindred spirit. And he was the guy who kind of took the ball and ran with it. It was like his idea to get fake IDs and actually go see this concert. Like I told him about Black Flag because I'd heard them on Radio Free Living Room, but he was the one who said, let's go see them. And then a little bit later, he was the guy who said, let's take these IDs of ours and go see these local acts. This guy, Charlie Pickett, and this other guy, Larry Joe Miller. Why don't we go to the Blitz in Hialeah and just go see them? So he really took the pointed stick and prodded me out of the house.
You mentioned the Blitz. I know Richard Shelter promoted shows at the Blitz and also other venues too, like Flynn's and the Cameo. Did you know of Richard at that point, or did you get to know Richard as you were going to more shows and also started to play in your own band?
Well, I was utterly clueless as to how anything worked. I didn't even know what a promoter was, at the time. But it's very funny because at that show at the Blitz, it was me and Santo and not a whole lot of other people there. And we were just sitting at the bar watching the music. And Larry Joe, it was like Larry Joe Miller and the Rockabilly Rockets. They went on stage and did their thing. They were great. And during the intermission, Richard Shelter came up on the stage and was like working the crowd and, chitting and chatting and being the MC. And he pointed directly at us and said, well, what about you guys? Are you guys enjoying the show? And I was just like, and Santa was like, yeah, man, we're enjoying the show. And he was like, yeah, great. So that was my first run-in with Richard Shelter. And anybody who knows South Florida history knows that we had a lot of run-ins with Richard Shelter over the ensuing months. But there's basically no getting away from the guy. There's no getting away from anybody, really, because it was a very small, close-knit scene. And everybody knew everybody else, which was great. It really was. There was this whole sense of community. And it was very easy and very natural, and it was a really wonderful thing because by the time that I started playing in bands and making music and writing songs, I was, getting into my own identity and my own look. And when I was a little kid, all I wanted to do was be a hippie. All I wanted when I was a little kid was to have long hair and maybe a beard. So when I finally got to the age where I was allowed to grow long hair, I grew it. But while still playing this punk rock and hardcore stuff. And the one thing I will never forget, and I will always be grateful for, was that I never once ever caught any flack for having long, shaggy hair and a long, shaggy beard. No one cared. Nobody cared what anybody looked like. I mean, I might have gotten spoiled because of that. It's like, if you were into the music and if you wanted to be at the show, you were there, and that's all there was to it. It's ironic. The only snarky comment I ever got was from Dave Camp, and it's very funny because I love Dave. I'm not really in touch with him very much, but he's a great guy. And if you want to interview somebody with a trillion stories, you've got to talk to Dave.
Dave is actually coming on the podcast this year.
Awesome. You're going to need about 4 hours for him. But Broken Talent had just played our second ever show. And I remember walking off the stage and walking out the lobby of Flynn's, and I was dressed. I didn't have any sense of fashion, really. I remember I had like a spiked bracelet and white corduroys and a pair of like two-tone Vans or something like that. And I was walking out the door, and Dave Camp looked at me and said, there goes the rock star. And I was like, what does he even mean? I don't even know what I'm doing, rock star? I did not understand what he meant by that, because I was certainly not trying to be a rock star. I'll have to ask him someday exactly what he meant by that, if he even remembered. Right. I don't know. But that's really it,
Is it true that the first show that Broken Talent had played, that the name was mispronounced, that the original name was Broken Palette? Is that true or is that false?
That is true. And I don't know if you were able to show graphics and whatnot, but I did send you a bunch of scans of flyers and stuff like that. But if you want to show the original flyer for the first ever gig we played, it does say Broken Talent, but the name was supposed to be Broken Palette, as in upper palate. And we were sitting around trying to think of a name for our group. Like, we were originally going to call ourselves the Priests, which I'm so glad we didn't, because that's a terrible name for a band. And we did have a show booked under that name, which got canceled before it, ever happened. I don't even know why. So we thought, well, what's one of the most painful things you can experience? Like, what's just got to be really agonizing? And somebody came up with a Broken Palette. And so we thought, that's a good name. We'll call ourselves Broken Palette. So what do you know? We book our first show ever at Flynn's in the pre-Richard Shelter days. And we see the first flyer and it says Broken Talent. I guess Santo booked the show over the phone and they just didn't hear him correctly. So, Broken Talent. Okay, I guess that's who we are. And it was certainly quite a while there, a very apt name, very appropriate.
It is fitting. I do like the name, and maybe it was just meant to be that way. But yeah, that very first show that was at Flynn's. Let me see
It
here.
was
I know.
a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. I'll just mention that.
Yeah,
If you
there
want to hear the
were.
whole story of why it was a nightmare, I'll be happy
Yes,
to tell you
yes.
there, Jeff.
Tell us why. Why was that first show a nightmare?
Well, the first show was a nightmare because, once again, it was Santo's idea. It was his idea to start a band. It was his idea to write songs. It was his idea to record a demo tape and get a gig somewhere. And I don't even know how he heard of Flynn's. You know, at the time it was booked by this guy named Howard Davis. And Flynn's was on 71st Street in Miami Beach, and we're talking about 1983. And at that time, Miami Beach was just nowhere. It was absolutely nowhere. It's where the old people went to die. That's all it was. Nobody was interested in Miami Beach at all. Old people and the occasional avant-garde type who would go down there and rent a storefront or something and live in the storefront because it was incredibly cheap and run down, and you could get away with just about anything, you know? So this guy, Howard Davis, somehow found Flynn's, which was owned by the Flynns, as you might have guessed by the name, and it was in this hotel, the Ocean 71, and he somehow found this place to do shows. And somehow Santo found out about him and said, well, we got to record a demo tape so we can play there. And I was like, okay, let's record a demo tape. So he and I got together in his parents' garage with, like, I don't even know what we had for instruments. I think I had a bass. He might have had an acoustic guitar. It was just the two of us and like a Radio Shack cassette recorder. And we just screwed around for like 20 minutes doing like the dumbest shiz you can imagine into this tape recorder. And he sends that to Howard Davis, and Howard Davis calls back and says, sure, you guys can play. We'll have you at Flynn's. And then it was like, oh my God, now we have to put a band together. Somehow we have to put a band together by whatever the show date was. So we knew a guy who played guitar, and right off the bat, we faced the problem that was going to plague us for the rest of our existence. And we didn't know anybody who played drums. We couldn't find a drummer. My youngest brother played drums, but he wasn't into punk rock. And after that, we had no prospects at all. Like, none. But we've got this gig coming up. And it's like, what do we do? So, in absolute desperation, I cobbled together like a floor tom and a snare and maybe a cymbal from my younger brother's original drum kit, which was a Brand X drum kit that he got. He might have got it from Playworld for all I know. But a snare and a floor tom and maybe a cymbal. And we just went around to all of our friends and said, hey, you want to try playing drums? We have a show. And most people said no. But a couple of people said, yeah, I'll try it. And we finally found this one older sister of one of our friends who was able to, like, simultaneously hit the floor tom and the snare while we went jung, jung, plunk, 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 plunk on our cheap instruments. And Santa was like, hey, caterwauling. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't care either. And so somehow we were able to kind of play 6 or 7 songs, you know, like a Devo song and a Joy Division song and a Velvet Underground song. We just made a couple of real bullshit songs up. And that's what we took to Flynn's that fateful night. And I will never forget the feeling of absolute terror when we load it in and we're set up on stage and it's time to sound check. And Howard Davis was sitting there on the sort of raised seating area behind what I guess would be the mosh pit at Flynn's. And he looked at it and said, okay, well, let's hear what you got. Let's hear a song. And we all just kind of looked at each other. We're like, oh my God, we have to play a song now for this guy? So we did. We sort of stumbled our way through Mongoloid by Devo. And we got through it. And I remember Howard Davis looking at us like, oh, okay. The show must go on. Okay. So that was sound check. And after sound check, our drummer said, guys, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do this. I can't do it. And she went home. Oh, great. Now we don't even have, the most rudimentary drummer in the world. Now we don't even have her anymore. So we ended up, I'm trying to remember the exact sequence of details. We ended up putting out a call for help, and some guy came up from the audience and played drums, and it sounded better than it ever did with our friend, because this guy could actually play drums a little bit. And we got through the set. I remember a couple of people tried to dance and gave up, and there was like some polite applause, sort of. But we got through it, and we never saw that drummer again. And then after we were done, I had my first run-in with Debbie Rage. She and a couple of her friends just kind of got up on stage and glommed onto our snare drum, and they were kind of having like a beatnik poetry reading around it, like they were playing the drum, and I was just trying to get the drum back so I could just go home. Finally. And they weren't giving the drum up at all. They weren't giving it up. They were doing their thing with our drum, and they weren't going to stop until they were finished. And so I just kind of, waited around until they were finally done. And when they were finally done, I said, can I have my drum back? She said, sure. And gave me my drum back. And she said, my name's Rage. Looking up at me. I was just like, hi, Rage. Yeah. And just got out of there. Just got out of there. And if we got paid back,
what was it about her that left you feeling like that?
Well, she was intense. She was really intense. She was not a frightened 16-year-old. How old was I at that time? I was 16 years old. No, sorry, I was 18 years old. 18 years old, never really out of the suburbs, finding my way, really enthusiastic and bright-eyed and everything, but completely green as a gourd, And she looked at me, and I saw somebody who knew exactly what she was doing, who was very intense. Her name was Rage, for God's sake. She was going to probably freak out and punch me in the nose, for all I knew. And she had the jet white hair, like dyed white hair, and she was dressed right. I mean, she was authentic. She was the real deal.
Yeah.
Here I was just like clueless. So that was my first reaction. Total fear.
I did find the flyer for the first show that you did with Broken Talent at Flynn's, and
this was the first time we properly set foot on stage. And to add insult to insult, we were the only band on that night. We had to play 2 sets.
Did the Sleep of Reason play with?
No, they were on the next night.
The next night, got it. Okay.
We played June 24th. They played the 25th.
Got it. Okay, I see how that's.
And I have no doubt they were a lot better than we did. Oh, and I should mention too that Rage's intro to me, which she looked at me and said, "Are you guys a joke?" And I don't think she meant it as an insult. I think she just wanted to know if we were a joke or not. And we weren't trying to be a joke. We just wanted.
Yeah. So it's kind of like two flyers in one. Yeah, I see that.
Well, there
So
you go. You see, Howard Davis was an efficient guy. He knew how to advertise two gigs at once.
yeah, absolutely. And I've had Oscar Herrera from The Sleep of Reason. Were you familiar with what they were doing back then?
I was not, because at this time I was still in fake ID land and without a car. So I was really at the mercy of anybody who could like give me a ride to a show or even wanted to. Because, you know, living in unincorporated Northwest Dade, it was probably about like maybe a half-hour drive to Miami Beach, which at that time was far enough. Nobody really wanted to do it. It wasn't until I got my own wheels, I think later that year, that I was really able to start going out to see shows and really began to blossom like that.
Right.
And I never saw Sleep of Reason. I never once saw them, ever.
Okay.
They were one of many bands I never got to see. Like, The Eat broke up by the time I was coming onto the scene. Saw Charlie Pickett a bunch, but other bands like the Cichlids were long gone. Screaming Sneakers were long gone. Zed Cars were long gone. So like that first wave of Miami punk rock, I missed out just because I was too young and had no transport.
But you knew of it. Like you learned at some point about who were some of those bands that may have come before, it sounds like.
Oh, definitely. It's like, you know, between the occasional sightings of local records at places like Music Makers or Peaches or maybe even Specs, and between like The Rag and Mouth of the Rat, and especially from the great Radio Free Living Room, WLRN, Monday nights at midnight, I think. I mean, that was the mother lode. That's where I heard this music for the first time. That's where I really had my ears turned inside out to the possibilities of local music and the fact that these people were accessible and you could go to a place like Flynn's or Finders or whatever and sit 10 feet away from them, and they were right there. No bouncers, no tickets. After they played their set, it would be hanging out over in the corner or at a table somewhere. No security. You could theoretically go up to them and say hi. You know, and this is all information that took me a while to assimilate, but it was all being presented at this time in these places. But yeah, Radio Free Living Room was really the key. And then when I finally was able to get a ride to Open Books and Records, when they were still at Progresso Plaza in Fort Lauderdale, and I was like, oh, this is a record by Charlie Pickett and the Eggs. This is a record by Screaming Sneakers. Like, this is real. This is tangible. And not only that, there's a room full of this kind of stuff. Man, game changer. Eye-opener. World broadener.
For those that never had been to Open Books and Records, how would you describe that music store back in its heyday?
Paradise, a wonderland. Just wonderful. Setting foot there for the first time ever with my friend and musical mentor, Tim Powell, who he never really got involved in playing or being in bands, but he was one of those guys who just had impeccable taste, perfect eye for fashion, and a wonderful sense of the absurd. He really took me under his wing and taught me a lot about what good music was. And he was the guy who gave me my first ride to Open Books and Records when they were in Progresso Plaza. And Progresso was wonderful because in a disgusting, sterile landscape like South Florida, which if you think it's bad now, well, I shouldn't say that. It's far worse than it was. You know, like South Florida, as I look back upon it, had its charm, but it was still sterile. It was still all concrete block structures. It was still housing developments with the same 5 floor plans, you know? Progresso was actually kind of like an older building, and it had like, you know, arched doorways and a breezeway, and it seemed like it had been there forever. And it was in the Searstown. It was by the Searstown shopping center by the railroad tracks, and that looked like it had been there forever. So
Is that by the War Memorial?
Yes, it's
Okay.
down the road from the War Memorial, if I remember
Okay.
correctly.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was like this one little taste of kind of like ancientness, if you will. It had been built before 1975, you know? It had this kind of old world feel to it. And that's where Open Books and Records was. And when you opened the door, it wasn't a glass, you know, door with an automatic opener. It was a door with a knob. You know, it's like little things like that. You can't put enough value on things like that when you grow up in a sterile environment. You opened the door and you walked in, and the first thing was that smell, the smell of a record store, like a real record store, a hint of incense, a bit of mustiness, some of that heady mixture of shrink wrap and fresh printed cardboard, and you know, the whatever the building itself had to offer in terms of kind of like wonderful mustiness. It was all there. And you walked in and looked around, and my eyes just lighted immediately on a copy of Still by Joy Division. Kind of thing you could only read about, but there it was in real life,
Right.
right there. And the person behind the counter was like friendly and smiling. I forget if it was Ted or Leslie at the time, but they were like, "Hey, how you doing? Hey, if you need anything, let me know." Just like they were interested, they cared. You know, it wasn't just some schlub behind the counter earning $3 an hour because they had to be there. It was somebody who was into it. And they owned the place. You could talk to the owner. You could actually talk to the owner of the store. And they were friendly and engaging and knew what they were talking about. Dude, why go to Specs ever again? You know?
Right. And that's one of the favorite things for myself when I go to a record store is when you talk to the person, whether they're the owner, whether they're just somebody working there as their job, and you learn about other kinds of music from that person. Did you feel like not only with open books, but did you find that when you were going to a lot of local shops, you were learning from talking to these folks about other bands, especially local bands in the area?
Absolutely. I mean, as far as local music goes, Open was the pinnacle. You know, they had their fingers on the pulse of the local scene. I mean, they put out the Charlie Pickett records. They did the Land That Time Forgot compilation. They were gonna do the first Bob's 12-inch. And I'm telling you, you got to get Leslie on the show because that'll be another 4-hour show. She can tell you all about this stuff. But they were in it. They actually curated, to use that modern day word, they curated Radio Free Living Room. They would just go into their inventory and bring a stack of records, and Eric Moss would play them and do the talkovers. So, I mean, brilliant, you know, how brilliant. What a brilliant way to advertise your record store without actually advertising your record store. Have a 2-hour radio show playing nothing but stuff from the record store. Sheer genius. So I would
Right.
hear all of this stuff. And I went to Open Books and Records and bought my first Charlie Pickett record, you know, stuff like that. Other record store owners turned me on to a lot of incredible non-local stuff. And I will always have a soft spot in my heart for Rich Yaloa of Yesterday and Today Records. Cool guy, super cool guy, always willing to listen to a brat like myself, ask questions or pontificate or whatever. The great Michael Dean of Yardbird Records. Man, what a sweetheart and what a great shop. You know, he turned me on to King Crimson and John Coltrane and beat poetry and stuff like that, you know. And then later on, you had Mark at Underground Records in Fort Lauderdale, which was the only dedicated punk rock store in South Florida. You know, and honorable mentions to a guy like Bob Perry from Blue Note, who I didn't meet until a lot later. Bob Perry, great guy. I forget the guy who owned Rankin Records, the great reggae store
Right.
on
Oh,
167th Street, North Miami Beach. I would go there and I would just listen to that guy talk, you know. And he had his records fresh off the boat from Jamaica or fresh off the plane if they were in a hurry. You know, this is like authentic, real Jamaican reggae. I mean, you can't buy an education like that.
I think I only went to his shop when they moved to US 1, and it was not far from Commercial. I want to say that was the only. I think he was still run by him at that time, but that was the only time I ever was there, and that was in the '90s.
Yeah. See, I left Florida in '86,
Right.
so I don't know what happened after late '86. Um, but for a little while, we had a pretty good strip in North Miami
Yeah.
Beach. Open Books and Records was right across from Peaches, and then a few doors down, you had Vibrations, and then a few doors down, you had Rankin, and for a while, that creep who owned Record Liquidators was there for a while. And I didn't like that guy very much, but he was the place to go to get bootlegs for a long time until he narked out everybody and shut down the entire bootleg trade in South Florida. Further down the road from that was Discount Records, which was a head shop record store that had a lot of bootlegs and cool stuff. Across the street was the 163rd Street Shopping Center, which had a record store in there. I mean, it was just like a real, playland for record shoppers.
Right.
Further down the road was a Vibrations. I mean, you could go to North Miami Beach and spend the whole day doing nothing but record store hopping.
Yeah. And
Just
with all these records and things that you were looking out for and picking up from not only national acts but also focusing on more local stuff, at what point did you and the rest of Broken Talent say to yourself, we want to put out something of ours, whether it be a cassette, whether it be a 7-inch, whatever it is? When did that come about for you guys?
Well, that happened very early in the game. And once again, it was Big Santo's idea. He said, well, look, the best way to get gigs is to actually have a record. If we have a record, people will take us seriously and we can get shows. So, like, as usual, I just kind of went along for the ride. And once again, he hooked the whole thing up because he was going to University of Miami at this time. And I didn't know a lot of this till later, but apparently he made real good friends with one of the librarians there. And the librarian would let Santo go into some of the old storage rooms where they sent old equipment and stuff to die. He would let Santo go in there and grab old reels of tape. And he let Santo take in this ancient reel-to-reel tape recorder, stuff that had been sitting there for decades, And so he just salvaged all this ancient, broken down stuff. So we had some reels of tape. We had a reel-to-reel recorder. In the golden day of Radio Shack, there was like a Radio Shack in every neighborhood. So you go to Radio Shack and spend $20 and get a highball microphone, a cheap-ass mic, but it was a mic. And you could buy like a mixer, like a little 4-channel mixer. All this stuff that was like really on the cheap, but actually allowed you to do what you wanted to do. So we were able to cobble together this setup with these Radio Shack mics and this ancient reel of tape. And I think I sent you a scan of one of the actual reels. And you can see just how beat up and repurposed this thing is. It's like these tapes and the recorder were at least 20 years old at the time. So our drummer, Kat, had an older brother who had a real mixing board, like a real 8-track mixing board or something like that. And he volunteered to let us go to their house and set up in the living room, and he would record us. So we did. We took the 3 songs that we were like the most adept at, which were Blood Slut, My Old Man, and My God Can Beat Up Your God. And we practiced them a bunch to where it got to where we could play each song from start to finish without completely falling apart. And then went to his house on New Year's Day, 1984, and just ran through the songs, just played them over and over and over again until we got a take that was usable of each. And I remember his name was Drew. He was really hungover from the night before. It was early in the morning. And all Radio Shack mics, ancient discarded U of M tape, and an ancient discarded U of M tape recorder. And that's how we did it. Excuse me. We took the tape back to Santa's dorm room. We picked out the best versions of each song, made a tape out of that. I don't remember how we did it. He probably scrounged up another reel-to-reel recorder somewhere. Copied the good takes onto a reel of tape, and he found a pressing plant in Hialeah called Miami Tape, which I've heard referred to by a couple of it, like the Smegma people pressed their record there. Because it was the only pressing plant in Hialeah, and it was cheap. So we took it over there, gave them our little reel of tape. They made a record. Voila, we had a record. And now we had something that we could give to promoters in order to get shows, and it paid off very quickly, actually.
Right. I think I have the picture here. This is the first reel?
Let's take a look at that. Yeah, that's not. I don't think that's a reel of the rehearsal. But look at that thing. Look at it.
Yeah.
It's been around the block several times, and you can be sure it was not the most expensive grade of tape you can imagine. But that's what we had to work with.
Right.
And that's what we always did. We just used whatever materials we had at hand. And I would say that was our ethos the entire time. We never had money for good gear. We never had money for good tape. We never had money for rehearsal studios, but we just somehow cobbled something together and just kept going out of just sheer dumb persistence.
Was all the money that you may have been getting from perhaps part-time or full-time jobs, however you were getting money at that time, each member, was it all just pretty much going into what the band was doing?
Pretty much. And that was like really the crux of the problem. For most of the time during Broken Talent, I was the only guy who had a steady job. And even that wasn't very steady. I worked at an inventory company, and the inventory racket was very seasonal and very sporadic, and it paid minimum wage. So I had that. Mark, our guitar player, was essentially homeless. The guy really had nowhere to live until our friend George put him up in his bachelor apartment in Miami Springs. So there's nothing coming in from Mark. Santa was a student mostly. No money coming in from him. And Shane, our drummer, who finally ended up sticking with us for a while, was also chronically unemployed. So it's like, we're living with our parents in the burbs, except for Mark, but there just really wasn't any money. We could just barely pay for a rehearsal space because nobody's parents wanted us to rehearse at home. That wasn't going to happen.
With Mark being homeless, like you said, or having some struggles at that time, he was in a lot of bands of the era and also into the 90s. I know he was in Harry Pussy, and he was in a lot of other bands that had existed, that I think even bands that maybe even shared bills with Broken Talent, like the Pop Cruds. Talk about Mark just for a minute, though, in terms of his talent and just being in so many different bands in the scene.
Well, Mark will be the first one to deny this, and he will not like me saying this, but Mark, as far as just like sheer musical ability and talent and brilliance, he was the one. He was the guy who really knew what he was doing. He taught me so much. He knew how to write a song. He knew what a hook was. He knew what a chop was. He knew how to end a song. He just knew all this stuff, And I would just sit there and listen to him and absorb all this, And like he had been in a band before Broken Talent called the Pop Cruds, who were just, if I might use profanity for a second, were fucking brilliant. The Pop Cruds, to me, was like what I wanted Broken Talent to be. I had three benchmark groups. Pop Cruds were one, Morbid Opera was the other, Gay Cowboys In Bondage were the third. Those were the bands that I really wanted to be like, in terms of what they could do, Like the thing is, I might have said this before, but our reach always exceeded our grasp. Like, speaking for myself anyway, like I had these ideas. I wanted to actualize, but just didn't have it together at that time, didn't have a good instrument, didn't really know what I was doing. But Mark did. And I never heard the whole story, but apparently there was some kind of big familial fallout. He got kicked out. And it's just such a shame, because if he had had a foundation at the time, he could have really got off the blocks and started running a lot earlier. Because as you said, he got into some really excellent bands later, some really good influential bands, and really got to strut his stuff. And he plays to this day, and he specializes in like real avant-garde guitar. And he was in a band called the Taiwan Housing Project, who just kicked ass, Excuse me, God bless him. He's a lifer, and he's going to keep going until they carry him out finally.
Yeah. Here's an old flyer from a show that you played, Broken Talent, ironically with Antiseen, who's, not to fast forward too far ahead, but a band that you're playing with currently. So, who were out of North Carolina, and Morbid Opera, who has come up. And also I remember when Libby and Carmen shared their story about Morbid Opera last year on the podcast, they brought up a story from you as well. And Lethal Yellow, who also, I believe, shared members, or there was a connection with Broken Talent, right?
Yeah. They were these young kids from down in Coral Gables, and we had this thing that we called the Broken Talent Auxiliary Corps. And I love those kids, man. It was all these people. It was just like, kind of in spite of ourselves, we ended up attracting these kindred spirits, people who actually liked us and who liked what we were doing and liked our snotty attitude and all that. And we just ended up sort of creating this kind of scene within a scene of our own, which was really bizarre, but it was fun. It was fun to actually have kindred spirits. It's such a rarity. It's like I mentioned before about how the South Florida scene in general was welcoming and all-encompassing and open. Like they accepted a nudnik like me, no questions asked. Finally, I had my tribe. But then within this tribe, we had these people who were Broken Talent fans. Generic Death from Jupiter, like kind of immediately aligned themselves with us. The guys from Lethal Yellow, the dudes from Fonzie's Nephews, which is like a sort of Generic Death spinoff, and all of their friends, and our friends George and Tim Powell and Lloyd Void. Like in a scene full of weirdos and misfits, we got the real weirdos and misfits, and just this thing sort of coalesced. And Lethal Yellow, they got their name from a Broken Talent lyric, and they were like these, dare I say, this is not dismissive, but I will dare say, poor little rich kids from the Gables. Gables was a well-moneyed community, but money's not relevant. If you're a misfit and you don't belong, that's the end of the story. It doesn't matter if you're from Gables or Jupiter or Perrine or Homestead, or if you got money or not. Lethal Yellow were the punk rock outcasts and misfits from Coral Gables. And they just sort of ended up being in our orbit. And for a very brief moment at the very end of Broken Talent's existence, their guitar player, Ivan, played second guitar with us. He did one show with us. Or the last ever show we played, he played rhythm guitar for us.
There's another flyer, perhaps around the same time period, with another band that I'm a big fan of, Pagan Faith. What are your memories of playing with them?
Pagan Faith were cool. I saw them at a gig, I want to say in Melbourne. It might have been one of the Hardcore Holocaust gigs, which was where like the real hardcore band played. Real hardcore bands played. The guys who were really proficient at their instruments and really good and could play really fast. Bands like Sector 4, Hated Youth. I would even put Roach Motel in that category. They wouldn't want to admit it, but they could play. They knew how to write songs. And Pagan Faith was one of them. And I just somehow ended up getting in contact with them and asking them if they wanted to play a gig in South Miami at the Brockway Theater, which was another place that Big Santo found through his connection at the library. This big old unused room that we were allowed access to have concerts. And so we put on a pretty good little handful of shows there. It was great. It was like a very nice room with lights and everything. And if we could cobble together a PA, we could do a show there. So I invited Pagan Faith down, and they drove in from Tampa, and they played the show, and they were great. S.L.A. was on there. I saw you had Aesop on your show at one time. S.L.A. was Aesop's first band.
Right.
And then looking at the flyer, of course, Lethal Yellow, us, Morbid Opera, Public Distraction. They were a hardcore band, I think, from Hollywood. Really cool guys. I don't remember Toxic Shock for some strange reason. I do not remember them at all. But they played, I guess.
Right. It does say TPOS presents. Now TPOS is you, right?
These days, and since 1986, it has been me, yes. But originally TPOS was the Broken Talent umbrella organization. Once again, I sound like a broken record, but it was all Santo's idea. He said, if we're going to put out a record, it has to be on our own label. And if we're going to run a label, it really should be like, and this might have been more like collaborative thinking, but we were definitely aiming for like what SST was doing, and to an extent what Factory Records was doing, in which the label was just an umbrella to where we could do records, publications, put on concerts, do art, like everything was going to be under the umbrella of TPOS. And that was definitely nipped off of the Factory model, because anything that Factory did was credited as a Factory production. The SST thing, we nipped off the idea of putting out all of our friends' music, and taking all of that as seriously as any label would take any band. And our numbering system was based on TPOS. It's like SST Records, #1 releases. It just wasn't #1. It was number 001. And I loved that because that signaled intent. #1 could just be #1, and then that's the end of it. But 001, that indicates that you're going to keep going until you fill those zeros up with 1s and 2s and 3s, and you're not going to stop. So TPOS 001 was Broken Talent. And as of this writing, I'm at the TPOS number 272. So thank you, SST, for making it kind of a fail-proof, kind of like a flake-out-proof numbering system. If you start with 001, you got to keep going until you filled up all 3 numbers.
Right.
And so that was basically it, promoting shows, doing whatever we could do under the banner of TPOS. And as time went on, as so often happens, everybody else just kind of fell away, and I was like the last man standing. So, okay, TPOS, here I am.
I think I was watching something that you had done, because you do your own YouTube series as well, and you had mentioned briefly it could stand for something, but you didn't really get into that. Does it actually mean anything?
Well, I like to leave that open for interpretation because it's more fun that way. If you twist my arm enough, if you put me into a bad enough hammerlock, I will tell you the story of how the only thing that me and Santo ever got in trouble for ever in high school was publishing an alleged, and I do mean alleged, underground newspaper. Once again, his idea. He just had all these ideas. He had this idea to put out an underground newspaper in high school called The Piece of Shit. It really seemed like a good idea at school, I swear. So in honor of that, we took the initials and made it our record label. And the name lives on to this day.
There it is.
And If American High School principal Fred Bertani is out there anywhere, hi, Fred. You were not able to straighten us out. Sorry. Oh, boy.
Now, I know that we've talked about some of the different places that Broken Talent had played, but one place in particular that was very infamous in the 80s, another Richard Shelter promoted venue that has come up many times, and rightfully so, it should, is the Cameo Theater. So, what are your memories, Malcolm, of your first time at the Cameo and then other shows that you may have played there, or perhaps even seeing shows as a music fan yourself?
Well, see, for me, the Cameo was kind of late in the game. I think Richard started booking shows there in '85. So I only caught like about a year and a half ish of Cameo action. And this is one of those areas where you got to give credit where it's due. Richard was the kind of guy who would go out and find places to play. You know, we actually had that in common with him. We were always looking for a place to play because South Florida, I can't reiterate this enough, was hostile towards punk rock. It was hostile towards anybody, like especially hostile towards anybody who is weird or outside or different. I mean, you risked violence by being a weirdo or an outsider, or if you were gay. You'd get beaten to death if you were gay in South Florida. There's this whole undercurrent of macho. So you were, in a lot of ways, you were running the gauntlet in South Florida. So you really had to find places to have shows and maximize them while they lasted. Because there was always some factor that was going to shut the place down. Either, I mean, just whatever. There's always some factor that put a sunset provision onto a South Florida venue. So he hustled around and he found the Cameo. Going back to what I was saying earlier about Miami Beach in the 80s was a wasteland, a no man's land. Nobody wanted to be there. There was nothing there. Nobody cared. It wasn't until they started shooting Miami Vice in my neighborhood on Ocean Drive and 11th Street that all of a sudden the normal people opened their eyes and said, oh, South Beach? Whoa, Miami Vice? Whoa, that's cool. I want to go there. And swarmed in and ruined the neighborhood. Fucking ruined it. Turned it into the fucking bullshit that it is now. Notice the profanity came back? I hate what they did to South Beach. South Beach, when I lived there, and when Richard Shelter lived there, and some of our other miscreant misfits lived there, was a playground. We had this entire city to ourselves. It was like us, the retirees, an occasional Haitian immigrant, and empty streets. We had it all to ourselves, and it was wonderful. It was so wonderful. So for him to get a place at the Cameo Theater was no mean feat. They were probably showing dollar movies, you know, second and third run features to 8 or 9 old retirees at any given moment. So they were like, yeah, sure, live music, why not? We got to do something bringing the paying heads. Why not? And so he did it. He turned it into a full-fledged concert venue, built it from the ground up as a concert venue because it was not equipped to do concerts. He had to get lighting together. He had to get sound together. He had to get staff together, all that stuff. And I don't remember what the first show was. But I remember seeing shows there early on in the run, like the summer of '85. He booked Suicidal Tendencies there. He booked Detroit's in there. He booked The Descendants. My favorite show he ever booked there was John Cale and the Meat Puppets. That was an awesome show. That was the kind of show you simply did not see in South Florida. I remember he tried to do a big showcase there with Charlie Pickett, which didn't turn out well because basically nobody showed up. Charlie Pickett was always a bar act. He actually has a release called Bar Band Americanus. That was his thing. But I give Richard credit for trying to break Charlie into playing the larger venues. If it didn't work, it wasn't his fault. He tried. I really don't. DRI played there, and I had a gig running the Spotlight for a long time. He had one single Super Trooper Spotlight with a white lens. So my job was to follow the lead singer with this Spotlight. And what it meant was I got to sit behind the Spotlight on the balcony and see the show for free. That was really about it. Of course, the Dead Kennedys played there. Last gig Broken Talent ever did was opening for the Dead Kennedys. Black Flag played there in January of '86. And that's about all I can remember, really.
Yeah. I have there's actually, what's interesting is that, at least from what you shared, Malcolm, is there's 3 flyers for the same show.
Mm-hmm.
So here's one of the flyers for Broken Talent, which, interesting, I would imagine in this time period, Dead Kennedys were more well-known at that point. However, Broken Talent is top of the bill. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, that was the Broken Talent flyer. That's the one that we made.
Oh, okay.
Santo made that one. He just thought it'd be really funny to put us on top and the Dead Kennedys on the bottom. Maybe it was a comment on star worship. Maybe it was just to be obnoxious. Whatever. There you go. That was our official flyer for the gig.
Was Raw Power and Sewer Zombies, were they local bands in Miami, or were they in other parts of South Florida?
Raw Power was from Italy.
Oh, Italy.
And they were fantastic. Those guys were real musicians. They played faster than, I don't even have an adjective, but they played real songs at like quadruple speed. They were great. Sewer Zombies were from South Florida. They were a put together prefab punk band that Mark Subversive came up with, and he had his label Subversive Records at the time. And that was the first and I think only show that Sewer Zombies ever played. They did a couple of full-length albums, but that's it. Yeah. They came and went. And I remember definitely being irked that they got billing over us. I didn't think that was particularly fair or nice, but
right.
To do. It was probably us reaping the karmic reward for being the obnoxious jerks that we were in the beginning of our career.
There's another flyer, same gig, same thing, Broken Talent at the top of the flyer, and this is this flyer is a little bit more going on. So do you remember who was the one responsible for drawing this flyer up?
Yeah, that's the semi-official Broken Talent version of the flyer. That was put together by Shane Sick Pup El Duce Hansen, our drummer. And Shane to this day is active in the animation scene. He lives in Portland, Oregon. And he's got a number of animation series that are up and about. He did a really cool comic book called Funeral Home Confidential. And he and I are still in touch, and we're working on a couple of projects that may or may not see fruition eventually. But same deal, put Broken Talent on top, be really obnoxious about it, and who cares? It's punk rock, man. It's that punk rock attitude.
It says Tofu Man next to your drawing. Were you vegetarian at that time?
I was getting there. I wasn't full-blown vegetarian yet, but I was working on it. I've always been health conscious to some degree, and I've always taken a certain amount of stick for it.
I'd imagine back in that time period is a bit more challenging than maybe how it is today. Now I feel like it's way more accessible. You can go to most restaurants and they have something you could have, versus maybe back then it may not have been like that. Did you find it was challenging getting into that kind of lifestyle back in the 80s and maybe even early 90s?
Absolutely, because back then there was only one health food store that I knew of in all of South Florida called the Unicorn. And they started out in North Miami Beach, which was great because so much of my activity was based in North Miami Beach. And later on, they moved further north and east into the 190s. And it was a lot more difficult to go there and get good health food. But that was the only place you could in South Florida,
Yeah.
And if they didn't have it, you were out of luck.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
It's a
And
lot easier now.
lastly, I imagine this was the real flyer or
Yeah, that's
the
the
official
flyer.
flyer.
That's the one that Richard Shelter put out, and that was the one designed by Serge, his in-house graphics genius. Serge is still out there. I see him on Facebook. Serge, if you see any flyer from Shelter Productions and it's got that specific look, that's Serge. And Serge was a sweetheart. He did some flyers for us. He did flyers for other, bands and acts. He wasn't like a Shelter exclusive. But that's his. And you'll notice that the Dead Kennedys are, of course, on top.
Right. They definitely are. And I've heard from some other guests, and it could have been at different places that Dead Kennedys had played, not just in South Florida, but also in Central Florida and other parts of the state, that could be a lot going on at a Dead Kennedys show. A lot of people that would come out to their shows, and things can get a little out of hand. Did you ever encounter anything like that, seeing or even playing with Dead Kennedys?
Nah, my entire time in South Florida was Peaceville. I never once saw a fight. There were no cops. It really was our own thing, and everybody got along with everybody else. I honestly don't remember any aggro. Apparently that became a thing later on after I left, and I'm glad I missed that, because that to me is contrary to the whole spirit of the thing. But really, no problems at all that I can ever remember in terms of violence or shows getting shut down or cops or anything like that.
Were you and your friends or even bandmates, did you ever venture out? I know you mentioned Melbourne, but did you go anywhere else, whether it be other parts of Florida, Gainesville, maybe even Orlando? Did you go anywhere else in the state to not only maybe play music, but maybe even see other bands play?
Well, as far as playing in South Florida goes, we only really played South Florida, Dade and Broward. We ventured up to Lantana once toward the end of our run and played a horrible show, god awful show. We got paid to stop, and it wasn't because we were like, Broken Talent, we're obnoxious but we're cool, but because we were like genuinely just bad. We were just not good, and they said, "Get out of here. Here's your $50. Go." We would go to see shows. We would go sometimes to Gainesville. There was a Hardcore Holocaust. I don't know if that was the actual name of it, but a big hardcore festival in Melbourne. We'd go to Atlanta sometimes to see shows. But as far as playing out of town, Broken Talent actually toured a couple of times. And as far as I know, we were the only band like in our orbit that actually hit the road and played outside of Florida. Like a lot of bands escaped either to New York or L.A. or Atlanta or tried to, but we toured. The only other act I can think of who actually toured was Charlie Pickett. And I guess the Throbs tour. That was one of David Camp's early bands. They apparently toured, but that was before my time. I didn't know them. But, we played the Carolinas. We played Atlanta. We went all the way up to Albany and back. Played Pittsburgh. Played CBGB a couple of times. We actually went out and did the loop and came back to tell about it, which was one of those things that really kindled that fire in me to keep doing it and never stop doing it, because touring is the best. It's a way of life, and once you get that bug, it ain't gonna let you go. But that's about it. We played South Florida and or toured.
I know when I had Mark Robinson on with Scott Lade from Foul Existence, who were out of Fort Pierce. I know Scott mentioned, not Scott, sorry, Mark had mentioned his relationship with you. Did you meet him because of some of those shows at that time? Is that how you guys got acquainted?
Man, that is such a funny story because I've been in touch with Mark a lot these days. He and I sort of have a collaborative venture where I release stuff that he owns the rights to. He's got a label called Punk Media, and he did a G.G. Allen album and a Tiny Tim album. He put out some stuff by Nervous Norvis, and basically I do the vinyl pressings on his titles. Super cool guy, love him. And I honestly don't remember him from those days, but we apparently did meet. We were at a lot of the same shows. We traveled in the same circles, but I didn't like really honestly sit down and get to know the guy until many years later. Go figure. And I never saw his band either because they were from way up there and we were from way down here, you know? Anybody that's outside of Dade or Broward, even Broward was like terra incognita. Broward seemed like it was on Mars, you know, when I was a kid. Never mind West Palm or anything beyond it. That was a long ass way away.
Yeah, and Fort Pierce is a bit of a hike from West Palm. So yeah, to try.
I remember that being one of the rest stops on the Florida Turnpike. That was usually where if the old man was driving, he would finally be hungry enough to stop for a meal, and that would be at the Fort Pierce Service Plaza on the Florida Turnpike.
Right.
That's how far away that was.
Yeah. Yeah. And with traffic in today's climate, it's even worse. So
I can only imagine.
I can only imagine.
Ugh, so glad I'm not there anymore. I've always said South Florida is a good place to be from.
Another venue that we haven't talked about yet, but also plays a very important role in what was happening in South Florida, especially Miami at this time, was Churchill's. Now, Churchill's, unfortunately, like many places, has officially no longer there. Kind of sad, as it was one of the last, really the last one down south that was still standing. And I want to talk about your memories of Churchill's, both playing with Broken Talent, but also going to shows and just experiencing what it was like back in that time period at a place like Churchill's.
Sure. Well, Churchill's was another example of finding a place because there wasn't anywhere. You had to find a place to have a show. Churchill's was discovered by my friend Todd Jenkins, aka Todd God. Todd was a dude from Ohio. He'd been in the military. And I guess when he got out, he ended up living in an apartment in North Miami Beach, just a couple blocks away from Open Books and Records. And so he liked good music and he would end up hanging out at the shop. And we'd talk, I'm in a band, blah, blah, blah. I can't find a place to play, yak, yak, yak. And I guess he was just out on a bar crawl one night and somehow ended up in the most unlikely place you can imagine, an English pub, like a full-blown English pub in the middle of Little Haiti. I don't even know how he ended up there. And anybody who's watching this now and doesn't know what it was like back then, you just can't imagine how unlikely that was, how completely alien and impossible a scenario like that was at the time. An English pub in the middle of Little Haiti. But my friend Todd found it. He ended up talking to Dave, the owner, and Dave was game. He was game. He was willing to do something that would bring some people in through the door. Very much like Hilly Crystal at CBGB. I don't think Hilly Crystal was ever cognizant at all of the music that he hosted there, but it made money, and so he let it happen. And Dave absolutely was not into punk rock, might not have been into music of any sort at all, but he let it happen. And you really can't underestimate the value of that. Just letting it happen. Give the kids a free rein. Let them have their weird bands. They can collect their money at the door. If I sell enough drinks, keep going.
Right.
It is invaluable to have someone like that who will just let you do your thing.
It is. You need people like that. You really do, who they may not be invested themselves from I'm into this, but they are behind what you're trying to do and give you an outlet and a space to do it. You mentioned a lot of the bands. What do you remember about some of those bands? Who were some of them that were playing Churchill's at that time?
Well, I booked the first show there ever, and it was supposed to be Broken Talent headlining, and we had the Prom Sluts on there, which was Sir Robert's band before Creamy Electric Santa. I don't know if Priya was involved in the Prom Sluts. I don't remember. But I do remember that Sir Robert was one of those guys who just kind of ended up being part of the Broken Talent auxiliary corps. He was attracted into our orbit. He was a cool kid, and we just sort of ended up hanging out a little bit, you know? And I know I sent you a flyer for that one.
You did, and I have that one ready to go. So
Please post
this
it because between us and the Prom Sluts, I don't remember who else. I think there was the only two.
it doesn't have anyone else on it, just
I guess
Broken
it was just.
Talent and the Prom Sluts.
And, of course, Broken Talent broke up right before that show. So the Prom Sluts played, and we had this guy, Hugh, Hue, who was like this old yippie, hippie, folky guy. He did a set of acoustic music. And I think I ended up getting together and like just jamming with whoever was there and wanted to just kind of make some noise for a little while. And that was the first night at Churchill's. And I have the whole thing on tape. I should let everybody know I audio recorded it because I audio record everything. And I do have Churchill's first ever night on cassette.
Wow. So this is the first show ever booked at Churchill's?
First show ever at Churchill's.
Wow.
Plain fact.
Wow.
And we did it the same way that Richard Shelter had to do it with the Cameo or whatever. We had to find a PA somewhere. I'm pretty sure the PA was supplied by our friend James, who was the leader of Aesop's first band, S.L.A., and then later White Riot. I'm pretty sure he supplied the PA. There were no lights. There was no stage. There was nothing. It was a real bare bones, hard scrabble, concrete block room in Little Haiti. And that's it. And there was, for a while there was a little bit of, I don't want to say conflict, but we had to charge money at the door to pay the bands. And Dave had these regulars there, like he had a darts team, and he had a couple of like really elderly couples who would show up to have their evening tipple, and it was always kind of weird because they didn't want to pay to get in. And of course they had never paid to get in, so they didn't want to pay to get in. And it was just, we had to work things like that out, like who to charge, who not to charge, who will pay, who won't pay. And it was like that until eventually the darts team went away and the old people died off, and it morphed into the venue, Churchill's. And Churchill's didn't really take off and start to fly until after I was gone. I'm pretty sure Todd ran it for a while, and then I think Rat Bastard probably took it over from him. I really don't know, but I think that's the way it went. But it was kind of the same deal. We just booked who we wanted to book. We booked, I'm pretty sure we had Morbid Opera there. We had, I think White Riot must have played there. Hugh played there. We had Leo Casino there. Leo Casino and the Liberty City Band, a really great funk R&B band who were sort of tangentially involved with the punk rock scene. No touring acts, nothing like that. Just local bands who we knew who were willing to make the schlep down to Little Haiti. And so that was in May of 86, and I was out of South Florida by October of 86.
Right.
So there you go, first 5 months. That was my involvement with Churchill's. I booked the first show, booked a few others after that, and then left.
I don't think I ever knew that that was the official first show at Churchill's. So that's a very historical fact.
Yeah, totally. I wish we had played it. I wish Broken Talent had been able to hang in there just long enough to actually play that show.
Yeah,
I think it would have been really good if we did. And maybe if we had been able to hold it together that long, we might have continued longer than we did. But alas, it was not meant to be.
Why do you think that was the case? Why did the band go out in the way that it did?
Mm, a real number of factors. I mean, number one, of course, we just couldn't find a drummer. We just could not find a drummer. We had Shane in the band for a while, longer than anybody else. But as I mentioned before, he didn't really have a job. He didn't have any money. He didn't own his own drums. I found out much later he'd never even sat behind a drum kit until he auditioned for us the first time. He faked his way. He faked his way into being Broken Talent's drummer, but he was good enough for us, so there you go. And we had our final falling out with him because there was an age gap and an attitude gap and all the things I mentioned before, and we just couldn't deal with him anymore. So we never had a drummer. We never had money. Mark was perpetually without a place to live. Also, Santo had started getting more interested in his studies at U of M than the band. He just kind of lost it. It's like everybody just kind of lost interest except for me. And I will never forget, I put together this show at Churchill's, and I had talked my youngest brother into drumming for us. My youngest brother was into hair metal, big time. Big hair metal, glam metal guy. But just for a favor, he agreed to sit in with Broken Talent for this one show. And so he even let us use his band's practice studio in Hialeah. So we practiced a couple of times, and Santo never showed up. He just didn't show up. We figured, well, okay, he'll show up at the night of the gig, and we can, as usual, just kind of fake it as we always have. The last rehearsal we had scheduled before the gig, my brother was there, I was there, Santo didn't show up, Mark didn't show up. And I said, you know what? Fuck this. There's no way I'm going to go out and play another slovenly, shambolic, we don't care, we're Broken Talent. I couldn't do it anymore. I wanted to play a show that was good. I wanted to be tight. I wanted to be like the Gay Cowboys and Morbid Opera and the Pop Cruds. And we had played shows like that. When we were on tour, we played good shows as a tight band. We played a show when we came back, I think at the Cell in Hollandale, and we were good. We were tight. Mike, a.k.a. Milo from the Gay Cowboys, was there. And afterwards he said, wow, you guys turned into like a good hardcore band. I was like, yeah, thanks. Coming from him, the master himself, he complimented us on how good we were. I could not go on stage and do another shambolic gig. So I said, screw it, we're done. And that was it. Nobody called, nobody asked why, nobody seemed interested. So that was it. No more Broken Talent.
I know, and this is fast forwarding many, many years later, Richard Shelter had involvement with putting on a reunion show of bands from two different venues. I feel like you had the Cameo Theater 80s Club reunion night. So both of those on two different days. I'm gonna just share the flyer for that show because on April 2nd, I believe this was 2017. If I'm wrong, please correct me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But
2017, right?
but on that flyer, Broken Talent was on April 2nd. Was that the first time since the breakup that there was some version of the band that got back together for this?
That was actually the second time.
Okay.
The first time was somewhere in the 90s. It always bugged me that we never played a proper farewell show. It really stuck in my craw for the longest time. So somewhere in the 90s, I don't remember exactly when, I reached out to Mark and to Santo and to Shane because they were all still living in South Florida at the time. I said, dudes, I'm coming down to South Florida for a visit. let's get together and play a show. Let's do it. And they were all on board. Everybody said, yeah, fine, great, let's do it. And of course, I'm living in Connecticut at the time. And I don't want to get into too much ugly detail, but basically the deal was they were going to get together and practice and learn the set. And I was going to come down and join them. I was going to practice the stuff on my own. And they were going to get a PA together and all that and have the show at Yesterday and Today Records. And essentially, I get down to Florida and none of that had been done. None of that happened. And, Santo showed up. Everything was running super late because they're out trying to find a PA. And I'm like, you're doing all this the night of the show? What the fuck? And you didn't even practice? I mean, I guess I'm going to air the dirty laundry now. What have we got to lose, right? So it's like, they just didn't do anything. And Santo ended up leaving because it was running so late. And Rich from Yesterday and Today is asking me, what's wrong? Where's the PA? Where's the band? I'm like, how do I know? I just came in from Connecticut, And so they finally show up with a PA, and it's me and Shane and Mark, and we just sort of did this half-assed bullshit for 15 minutes, and that was it. So that was extremely unsatisfying, as you can imagine. So you fast forward to Richard Shelter's Miami Punk Rock High reunion, which was actually over 3 nights. He did a sort of pre-party thing at the Creepy Tiki up in Fort Lauderdale, like an all-acoustic night, and then the 2 nights at Churchill's. So by this time, Mark is living in Philadelphia, Shane is in Portland, Oregon, Santo is still in Florida. And I still really have it established in my mind that I want to put a bow on the box. I want to wrap this thing up and play one final show that's not a fucking mess. Mark was game and Shane were game. They were both into it, but they couldn't get to South Florida for one reason or another. It just wasn't going to happen. They didn't have the means or the ability to do it. Excuse me, Santo was on board. So I reached out to my old legitimate BFF. Sometimes when you say BFF, the second F does mean forever. My BFF, Jill, who I have known since we were in high school and has been with me through everything that there is to be through, including the very early days of Broken Talent. She played bass at our second ever gig, and she was just always there. She ended up playing drums with a great all-female punk band called Angry Pudding for a while, with a bunch of other South Florida female alum. So Jill had gotten fairly adept on the drums after a while, and she was always there. So I said, Jill, would you? She said, yes. Awesome. So now it's me and Santo and Jill. Lo and behold, we did get together. We practiced a couple of times. We had fun. It was good. And we played the Miami Punk Rock High School. And it wasn't an embarrassment. People enjoyed it. We enjoyed it. We even did a brand new song, So that was cool. And that sort of put it to bed for me once and for all. I feel like we finally put the bow on the box, and we can now just sort of move on.
I'm glad to hear that you had a chance to do a take 2, and it sounds like it worked out better. And to your point, Malcolm, putting the bow on it, a nice way to have that swan song for a band that was very important to the scene in South Florida at the time, Broken Talent. And it was great to know that you had that chance and to come back to a place like Churchill's. And I can imagine from when you were going there in the early days of its beginnings to fast forward 2017, was it different for you returning? What was that experience like?
I don't know. I'm not really like a nostalgic guy or anything. To me, it was just another place to have a show. I was impressed by all the work that had been done to it over the years. Like, they doubled the size. They had a real PA. They had real lights. They had Rat Bastard there, who, from what I understand, has been the driving force for many years back there. He really whipped the place into shape. It was still a grimy dump, It was still a total dive. People talk about how the CBGB bathrooms were the worst ever. You're wrong. Churchill's bathrooms were the worst ever. I am going on record saying that. And I've been to some punk rock bathrooms in my day, all over the US. I've been to punk rock bathrooms in England and Wales, Belgium, France, Mexico, Canada. Churchill's had the worst, grossest, nastiest, stank bathrooms on planet Earth. No argument. But it was great to be there. It was great to be there. You know, it was cool. You know, it still had the essence of punk rock. It was fun. I loved seeing everybody there.
Yeah.
You know, rekindled some real friendships there, you know. Saw people I haven't seen in decades.
Oh, I bet.
You know, got a chance to shake hands with a couple of people. You know, one thing that I always regretted was that when Broken Talent first started out, we were just like a bunch of brats. We were snotty. We were insufferable, thin-skinned, defensive, took things way more seriously than we should have. And a lot, you know, there were people who definitely liked that, but we definitely, I think, were more obnoxious than was called for sometimes. And, you know, Richard Shelter actually, we randomly bumped into each other at Open Books and Records one day. And we'd been making fun of him and razzing him, and, you know, certain people in our orbit had been crank calling him and stuff like that. And, you know, we ran into each other, and he sat me down and he said, "Look, you guys can't do that. You make it difficult for me to do my job. How else are we going to get shows to come down here? How else are we going to get bands to play South Florida if my answering machine is clogged up with your bullshit?" You know, he just sat down and explained it to me. And I was at least smart enough to say, oh, you know what? He's right. And so from there, I was able to talk to the other guys and say, you know what? We should just leave this guy alone. He's not evil. Let's just leave him alone. You know, he's a better ally than an enemy. And so we were able to put that behind us. And I ended up being Richard Shelter's roommate about a year later, living on South Beach, you know? So that was kind of another full circle thing that was very nice to actually settle once and for all, and a real lesson in growing up and maturing a little bit.
Right.
You know, there's always been, and I'm not saying anything that people don't already know, there's always been kind of a personality gap between Richard and a lot of people in the scene, but you got to give credit where it's due. He did do what he did it well, and we would most likely not be sitting here talking about the South Florida scene, at least for the time that it existed after I left, if it wasn't for his work. Yeah, plain and simple.
I know there's a soundbite of Richard getting up on stage and saying that Broken Talent is his favorite band. Is that true or is that false?
No, that is true. That was at the Tropical Depression Hardcore Festival at Fireman's Hall in Fort Lauderdale. Another example of just having to find a venue. Tony Latino of Tropical Depression found that venue and had this gig there. At least I think she found it. I heard somewhere that maybe the Drills played there, or one of the Lauderdale bands found it. But as far as I know, Tony is the one who found it and booked that gig there. And we were still in the middle of our stupid beef with Richard, you know, and everybody knows what's going on. And, you know, it's mildly amusing to a lot of folks. So Mike Shannon, who was the MC that night, said, "Hey, Broken Talent's going to come on up. You know, they're Richard Shelter's favorite band." And of course, Richard bum rushed the stage to do the intro. And I used the recording of that at the very beginning of the Broken Talent cassette anthology I released a bunch of years ago. You know, but there you go. He grabbed the bull by the horns and defused the entire situation. I probably should have learned right then and there. But yeah, it's true. He came up there and sort of really, by sincerely giving us a kick-ass punk rock intro, totally took the wind out of our sails. Totally took the piss out of us. What a strategy.
Well, I know it's been great just talking about all the things that had existed. I know there's so many stories and so many memories, and you really did capture some wonderful moments, Malcolm, of the existence of Broken Talent. And I know you have done other things in your musical journey outside of that. You mentioned that it was in the mid 80s that you moved out of Florida. So I want to talk a little bit about what your life was like after Florida. Maybe you can give us a snapshot into what that was like for you as you headed more towards the northern part of the US.
Sure. Well, um, long story, as long as you want it. While working at Open Books and Records, I met a woman who was from Connecticut and was as disaffected with South Florida as I was. And she had an idea. She said, "Why don't we go back to Connecticut, where I'm from, and open up a record store?" And I said, "Sounds good to me." Just another example of somebody having a good idea that I was able to glom onto and run with. So it was a literal May to September romance. I met her in May. We got married in September. And in October, we had packed up and moved to Connecticut to open said record store, which is called Trash American Style, and had a really good run for 21 years in Connecticut.
It's an amazing run for a record store.
It really was. And we probably would have kept it going except for the nefarious machinations of our landlord, who summarily decided that we were not going to have a record store anymore. And that was in 2008 when the real estate bubble was fully inflated and we simply could not afford a spot anywhere at the current market prices. There was just no way.
Right.
A record store is always, and I'm sure a lot of independent record store owners will tell you this, record store ownership is marginally profitable at best. Except for that wonderful golden era in the 90s when alt rock and grunge were king. Only time we ever made money was in the 90s. But by 2008, I was down to one part-time employee and just working 70 hours a week there myself, and impossible to afford a storefront at that time. So the brick and mortar Trash American Style was no more, but I kept doing it as a sort of a freebooter. I would do record shows. I had a circuit where I would go to colleges and sell records at the colleges. I'd go to punk rock shows and do distro. Always kept the mail order going. Always kept TPOS as an active label. And so since 2008, I've been able to stay in the business as, I don't know, a freelancer, if you will, without brick and mortar. So, the internet ended up being a good thing because I sell on Discogs, eBay, Bandcamp, all that good stuff. I use Facebook as a platform, not only for staying in touch with everybody, but, for selling stuff. What can I tell you?
Right. I know I bought my share of stuff from you too.
Did you? Good man.
Only good stuff though. Only good stuff though, Malcolm.
Well, duh.
Now, when you would do some of the shows where you were selling records and also even owning the shop, Trash American Style, did you ever have any moments? I know you were far away from where you grew up in South Florida, but people migrate, right? They get around and what have you. Did you ever have any run-ins with people who may have been a fan of Broken Talent that knew of the band, even though you had moved so far away from home?
I didn't get much of that in Connecticut at all, but once I started touring in earnest in 2011, because I started doing solo acoustic hardcore. I don't call it acoustic punk because most people equate that with emo. I don't do emo. I'm an old hardcore guy with an acoustic guitar, and it goes like that in your face. I digress. I started doing acoustic touring in 2011, and I'd be in the damnedest places. Somewhere like North Charleston, South Carolina, or Jackson, Michigan, or Spindale, North Carolina, or Tucson, Arizona, and I would run into people who actually either knew me from Broken Talent or knew me from Trash American Style or the Bunny Brains, which was a band I was in for a long time. I'm like, really? You know who I am? It's just like very strange. And in large part because of that, to this very day, the old Broken Talent song, My God Can Beat Up Your God, is a staple of my set. I play it all the time. I play other Broken Talent songs. I do Smaller Than Life. I do Blood Slut, Kill the Dead. There's any number of old Broken Talent songs that still have legs and people still want to hear, which is really kind of nice, because I look back and I think about how we never, at least in my mind, never really achieved what we could have. It's just very refreshing, and it's very positive to know that the songs themselves have that much life in them. Beyond the clumsy, what I see is the clumsy presentation and what I perceive as the half-baked production, and the fact that we never got them down the way I thought we should have gotten them, that the songs have that kind of durability and that worth to where people still want to hear them 40-something years later. That's nice. It's really nice.
It is. I've actually seen other people's playlist of hardcore punk from the early 80s, and My God Can Beat Up Your God I've seen on other people's playlists. So to me, that is really amazing to see, because there's so many bands, right, across all different states, and for people to have discovered at some point, at least I imagine they know more than just one song, but that is perhaps the hit from Broken Talent.
It's the one, and I also have to thank my boys in Antiseen for that, because back in 1991, they did a cover version of it and released it as the A side of a single, which, was released in Australia but had worldwide distribution. And I think that their version of it really kind of jump-started it a little bit and turned that particular song onto a whole new generation of people. And I haven't played it with them in quite a while, but up until recent memory, it had been a part of the Antiseen set list, and people still know it and still like it and still want to hear it. So thanks, guys.
That is pretty cool. And then sometimes that is what it takes to put something back out there and to get people to go back and revisit the
Yep,
originators of that song. And I know you were talking about Blood Slut, and I want to talk about that record just for a quick second because it came up,
sure.
because you being someone that does still sell, I mean, you have your label, but you still sell records, right? That perhaps is the most valuable record in the discography of Broken Talent. Is that true or is that false?
I would venture to say that's true. I mean, I've put out a lot of things that, like I've released a ton of stuff by Gigi Allen over the years, and Gigi's fans are pretty fanatical. And a few of the releases I did early on have become really collectible, but I don't think to the extent that good old TPOS 001 has, and a large part of it is just the story behind it. The fact that we pressed 500, but out of those 500, close to 150 of them were unplayable. Because the place we used, Miami Tape, it wasn't the cheapest place in town for no reason. I mean, I remember I was actually there in the control room while the cutting engineer was making the lacquer, and he was smoking cigarettes. He was smoking like a horse and blowing smoke all over the lacquers. And any cutting engineer from a respectable studio would have had a heart attack and died witnessing that tableau. This guy didn't care. He's got cigarette particulates all in our lacquer, which he sent off to get plated and pressed. The vinyl was thin. It was cheap. It was all regrind, which is to say recycled, old, ground up records. The guy actually showed me this great big hopper of ground up, chopped up old disco 12-inch singles that they remelted to make new records.
So the Broken Talent could be a grinded up old disco record.
It's probably an old Casey and the Sunshine Band dead stock 12-inch. Most likely, yes.
Well, at least it would be someone that is from South Florida, at least
True that.
that's something.
True that. Anyway, it was a cheap ass pressing. And we kept getting complaints from people that their records were warped and unplayable. We had to replace a lot, you know? So I remember this so clearly. It all reached a head. I think the second time we played CBGB, we just sat down with all of our copies of Blood Slut and examined every one of them by hand, sitting on the stage at CBGB. And we ended up with this great big pile of potato chips, as I call them, because they were just so warped. You could see visually how warped they were. And so we got this big old pile of them. We played our set. We just tossed them all out to the crowd. And I swear they all came back to us in pieces. It was like a blizzard of shattered vinyl coming back at us. So that accounts for about 1/3 of the entire pressing. They were destroyed at CBGB, and even if they hadn't been, they weren't playable anyway. Right. So I think that added a bit to the mythology. And you know, the mark of demarcation for Killed by Death collectible hardcore records is December 31st, 1983, as I understand it. If it's after that date, it doesn't have the same legitimacy or cachet that anything 83 and before has. Our record came out on March 1st, 1984.
Right.
We were just 3 months too late, you know? That'd be like a $2,000 record if it had come out 4 months earlier. But as it is, I'm satisfied.
Yeah.
We got our little blip on the record collector's radar, so I'm fine with it.
It totally is, and it definitely is a collectible. And when you go to a lot of the record shows and what have you, I know you're there to sell records, but as a fan of music and as a fan of records yourself, do you find yourself looking for any rare Florida records? Do you ever come across any in your own travels?
Believe me, dude, when I'm at a record show or a record store, I'm there as much to buy as I am to sell. And really, I've got just about everything Florida I ever wanted. You know, the ones that matter the most to me. I got both of the Eat 45s. I got the Morbid Opera. I got the Gay Cowboys In Bondage. I've got the Future Risk album, the F 12-inch single. Those are all the ones, you know, Roach Motel stuff. Those are all the records that I wanted personally. A lot of Florida stuff has passed through my hands, like the Reactions records and a few others, I guess, but I was never really into the Reactions, so I let those go. You know, because at the end of the day, I do have to make money, I do have to pay the bills, and I can't keep everything. So I've held everything that I really wanted and let the others find new homes where they'd be appreciated. Got my Teddy and Frat Girls single. That record flamed my brain when I heard it on Radio Free Living Room. I'm never parting with that one. You know, stuff like that.
I don't blame you. One band you mentioned that I had Jeremy Colas sign on from Future Risk. One of my personal favorite bands. They were so different. No one really sounded like them down there. And even I think broader. They had such a unique sound. Did you ever get a chance to see Future Risk play back in? Did you know a lot about them when they were playing down in South Florida?
Nothing at all. They were just a little bit before my time. I think by the time I started going to shows, they were already done. Shame. Loved them. Kind of the same thing with Spanish Dogs. Their 45 Assaultine Crackers is one of the maybe top 10 record to come out of South Florida as far as I'm concerned. But they'd already come and gone. I never got to see them or anything. But I heard that song, I Don't Want to Go to Cleveland, on Radio Free Living Room. Instant hit.
Yeah.
Another record I will never part with. And I have never even knew those guys, but I got a chance to finally meet Randy Ruffner, who is the brains behind the Spanish Dogs. He was living in Asheville, North Carolina, and he's died recently. But we hooked up through Facebook. Hell of a nice guy. Super cool dude. I got to meet with him in Asheville for lunch. I got a short little stack of each of the Spanish Dog records off of him and kept one of each for myself. The rest were up for grabs, but it was just so great to finally meet this guy and chit chat a little bit, you know, and he was just a very gracious, very nice dude, which is typical of the South Florida scene, really. I mean, there are some exceptions, of course, but the vast majority of people were just open and accepting and super cool. For a snotty little long-haired punk like me from unincorporated Northwest Dade to finally find home, you can't put a price on that.
Right. That's true. And to kind of take us to the end here, going back to the early beginnings of Broken Talent, one of the early shows was with Antiseen.
Mm.
And you fast forward, what is it? 40 years?
I'm looking at
I'm
40.
ballparking here. I could be off, but
Yeah.
you're thinking we're talking a lot of time has passed. And one of the bands that you had played with your other band, you're now in Antiseen. Was that connection back then? Did that have anything to do with you being in the band all these years later?
It had everything to do with it. I first actually met Antiseen on the first Broken Talent tour that we did. And to even call it a tour was a bit of an overstatement. We had 3 shows booked over the space of a week. We did Atlanta, I believe it was Raleigh, North Carolina, and I forget the third town we played, but a lot of down. Oh, Columbia, South Carolina. Duh, because that's where we play with Antiseen. And this goes back to what you had to do to book a tour back then. Another entity that I cannot understate the pricelessness of Maximum Rock and Roll, the great punk rock magazine, and to a certain extent Flipside, and also to a certain extent the local magazines and local zines. But Maximum Rock and Roll was the kingpin of all of them. Maximum Rock and Roll had a scene report in every single issue where people from all over the world would write in and talk about their town, the bands, the venues, the labels, the radio stations, and would quite often have contacts for all of these people. And that's how you got your information. No internet. You know, you got it by getting ink all over your fingers and smearing newsprint and having a marker and a pen and pad and writing all this stuff down and writing letters and making expensive long distance phone calls. So to book the first Broken Talent tour, I got out Maximum Rock and Roll and started making phone calls. And Jeff Clayton, the lead singer of Antiseen, had written a scene report, talked about how he was willing to host bands. So I called him up. He set up the show in Columbia, South Carolina. Antiseen opened. And all I can say was, by the time they were done, I did not want to take the stage. They were a damn near impossible act to follow. You know, besides being, you know, tight and having killer songs, they had smoke bombs and flash pots and, you know, mannequin parts and dueling, like using guitars in a sword fight and blowing shit up and costumes. I mean, oh my God, they had the whole package. They'd only been together for less than a year at that point, and they were just like a force of nature. So we had to follow that.
Yeah. I have the flyer to share too from that South Carolina gig.
Oh yeah, let's take a look at that. There you go.
And the name was spelled differently back then, right? So they had scene as like the scene versus being seen.
I didn't know how to spell it at the time. That Santo made most of the flyer, and I did the lettering. And I didn't know how to spell their name. So there you go.
Did you take any heat for that later on?
Actually, no. I don't know if the guys even saw that flyer, really. I don't know if anybody saw that flyer. I can't believe I even found a copy of that.
Yeah.
Somewhere somebody posted it on the internet, and I had forgotten about that flyer. I hadn't seen that thing in, since the day we made them,
And this flyer is pretty provocative.
Yeah.
Talk about that for a minute, because this is something that I don't know if you would see this today. Maybe you would. I don't know. But what did you do the design of this flyer?
Truthfully, I don't remember if I can take credit for that. I'm pretty sure. Actually, you just jogged a memory that was way back deep in the storehouse. I want to say that Brian Douglas Clemens came up with that design, because we took Brian on tour with us, along with Libby from Morbid Opera and Lloyd Void, who would later be in the Trash Monkeys, and our friend George, who was later in the Stun Guns. It's like you had this roving band of South Florida gypsies who every one of us was in a band or would be in a band later. And of course, Brian, did his poetry. He did this kind of ranting poetry thing. And I remember very clear that he made a flyer for that show showing a clipping of a Klansman taking off his hood. And he made that one for sure, and he might have made the one you just showed. Or Santo made it. I honestly don't remember. But, our whole thing was, we had a song called What the Klan Did for Me, which I wrote, and was about the Greensboro shootings back in 1984, and how basically the Klan got away with murder, and the cops helped them get away with murder. And I was just outraged by the whole thing. So I wrote that song, and I think that the ideas for the flyer kind of took off from that. Of course, we were totally on that tip, like the whole MDC, no war, no KKK, no fascist USA. I never liked MDC musically per se, but lyrically, like them and the Dead Kennedys and a lot of the real political left-wing bands at the time, I was there. I was on board with that. We all were to some degree or another. And so we're like, okay, we're playing South Carolina and North Carolina. There was definitely a bit of snobbery, like, oh, we're going into the real sticks, the real wilderness, we'll make this provocative flyer, which at the end of the day, nobody cared about, really. The Carolinas, of course, weren't as backwards as we thought they were, and the people were really cool and all that. We played that song. Nobody tried to run us out of town. But that was definitely like our statement on, specifically for me, Greensboro and what had happened there.
And with some of the other bands you have played with over the years, I know Broken Talent didn't do a lot in terms of touring. Do you feel like you've been able to go to a lot of the different cities and places around the U.S. that you would have hoped to have gone to, maybe when you were with Broken Talent?
Well, at this point, I've played every major city that there is to play, and a whole pile of the minor cities as well. And, the reason why I even booked Broken Talent tours to begin with was because I was fascinated by other places, and the Maximum Rock and Roll Scene reports really whetted my appetite for that. I wanted to go out and see these places. I wanted to meet these people. I wanted to know what it was like to wake up in the morning and look out the window and see something other than a concrete block structure with a palm tree. I wanted to know where these people worked and where they went to school and where they did their grocery shopping and the kind of music that they made. I really wanted to go out there and see something beyond South Florida. And what better way than to take your act on the road? And so in 2011, after I lost the record store and I'd gotten settled into a nice groove, I was able to start booking tours, as a solo acoustic, which is much easier than trying to book a band. One guy, it was like one man, one car, one guitar. Give me a sofa or a clean spot on the floor and a chance to pass the hat, and I'll come to your town and I'll party it down. So because of that, I have been everywhere. Like for a long time, my benchmark was to play 60 shows a year. And if you're going to play 60 shows a year, you got to play 60 towns a year. And that's how you get to see the world, because the major cities are great, love them. But if you really want to see the world, you got to play your Clitheroe, Englands, and your Boulogne-sur-Mer, France's, and your Stockton, Californias, because that's the real world. That's reality. Having said that, what do you want? New York, London, L.A., Detroit. I mean, I love those big cities.
Sure.
But I'm especially fond of the small, out-of-the-way nowheres, and getting to go to a place and give someone a good show that they might not normally get.
Right.
and get to experience a part of their lives that I never would have gotten to experience. So to answer your question, yes. And I always have to give big fat props to Santo, especially for opening my eyes to the fact that it was even possible. I doubt very much that I would have taken it upon myself to start a band or a record label or an underground newspaper or book a show or whatever. You know, he got the ball rolling. Mazel tov, Santo.
And that's important. And the people who were a part of the journey are just as important. They're just as important. And they were there during the good times and during the bad times, and it's all worth it. So it's just great getting a chance to talk to you, Malcolm. I really appreciate all that you've shared. Really taking that deep dive into your life and Broken Talent and some of the things you've done outside of that, and it's just been great having a chance to finally have you on the podcast. I know we're getting close to wrapping things up here, so I always want to make sure I give you the last word. Any final thoughts, comments you want to share to fans, supporters out there alike? I want to turn it over to you to take us home. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, I would like to take this chance to thank everybody, starting with my compadres in the South Florida scene way back then for being so open and accepting, and in a few instances, as patient as you were with a bunch of snotty young jerks from unincorporated Northwest Dade. What we had at that time really was unique and special, and my ability to be a part of it has absolutely made me who I am today, and I will always be grateful for that. And I will always be grateful to the people and the music and the art of that scene, because it was one heck of a launching pad. And of course, to everybody and anybody who's ever booked a show for either me or Antiseen or any of the bands I've ever been in, if you booked a show, gave me a place to stay, fed me a meal, threw $1 in the hat, thank you. You've kept me out of the job market since 1986, and I am super grateful for that. As far as what I might be able to give to anybody out there, if you want to be like me and live an ideal life and a wonderful life and a rewarding life, what I've always said, what I've always advised is to find your art and make it work for you. And I don't care what your art is. Your art might be accounting. It might be as a mechanic. Your art might be cleaning carpets. It doesn't matter. If there's a thing that you love and that you really just want to do it. Find a way to make it work for you. If a nebbish like myself can find a way to make the rudimentary acoustic guitar ability and the ability to play a bass and bag groceries, if I can make that work for me, you can make your thing work for you. You just got to do it. You got to be prepared to bleed occasionally, and you must never give up. But you also have to keep in mind that the rewards far outstrip the detriments if you love what you're doing and you stick with it and you mean it. If you mean it and you keep doing it, I'm willing to bet that you'll do okay. So that's what I give to you. And I want to thank everybody again for watching today and checking out any of my other endeavors. I could not do it without you. And I'll just say in my signature sign off, hope to see you guys out there somewhere, somehow. And until we do meet again, this is Malcolm Tent saying so long from the Tar Heel State.